Welcome back into the Daily Dose. I'm Jeff Hansen. The show's brought to you by Give'emHellBrigham.com and by CougarSportsInsider.com, part of the 24/7 Sports Network. Thank you so much for your support of the show. Those of you who have already subscribed, thank you. Those of you who have not yet subscribed, what are you doing? Please do so. Like the video, leave a comment, share the video, fuel the algorithm. It helps us out a ton. Thank you so much for your support so far. What a weekend for BYU. Holy cow. I have been to BYU I don't know how many times in my life. Lots. I have never felt an energy like the energy that is there in Provo right now. I mean, even the days of like Jimmer Fredette when he was doing his thing. I wasn't alive, but I can imagine national championship era, 1983, 84. That was a pretty good time for BYU football. I can imagine there was a pretty incredible energy down in Provo. I don't think it was like this. I know Jimmer's wasn't like this, no matter how good Jimmer was, because this energy in Provo right now is impacting every level of BYU athletics, from administrator to coach to trainer to fan to player, across every sport that BYU offers. It is a completely new era of BYU athletics, and it is fun to be a part of. We don't have to talk about it happening in the future now. BYU and UCF and Houston and Cincinnati are all officially Big 12 members. It happened. It's official. It's done. It's over. Now, BYU has to start competing in the Big 12. They've got to start working towards winning the Big 12. And on the football field, at least in 2023, if BYU is going to have any chance of doing either of those things, it has to start with Kedon Slovis. BYU has got to get good quarterback play out of Slovis. Now, we've talked about Slovis at a high level. We've said, USC Slovis will be fine. If BYU gets USC Slovis, BYU's in good shape. If they get Pitt Slovis, maybe there's going to be some problems. But we haven't really talked about what that means, and we haven't dug deeper, and we haven't looked at how Slovis compares to BYU quarterbacks. So, with the help of our friends at Pro Football Focus, allow me to go through some metrics and some stats, and let's just talk about some things here. I would flash them up on the screen, but we're going to go kind of quick, and we're going to bounce over things, so bear with me here. First thing I want to do is I want to take Taysom Hill in 2016 and compare him to Kedon Slovis in 2022. So we'll start with Taysom. Of course, Taysom was playing under Ty Detmer's Ty Detmer's offense. It kind of felt like a defense, if we're being honest with ourselves. Playing under Ty Detmer's offense, first year under the offense, first year under Kalani Sitake, ton of talent on that roster. Also in the backfield with Jamal Williams, really solid, not great, but solid offensive line. You guys remember 2016. Here were Taysom Hill's stats. He completed 58.6% of his passes, 12 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. He finished with a PFF grade of 65.7, which is fine. It's not great. You're not going to cast anybody away for a 65.7, but it's not great. You're not writing home and bragging about it either. 4% of Taysom Hill's plays were turnover-worthy plays. That doesn't mean that it resulted in turnovers, right? Maybe it was a swing pass to Jamal Williams and Jamal had a pass breakup when the defender got there. I don't know. Turnover-worthy plays is plays that could have resulted in a turnover, but something happened, a dropped interception, whatever. Only 1.7% of Taysom Hill's throws in 2016 were big-time throws, according to Pro Football Focus. Of course, Taysom has the benefit of being Taysom. He added 603 rushing yards and 8 scores with his legs, so there was that element of his game. But as a passer, Taysom was pretty pedestrian, and I think everybody would agree. And now we've seen what Taysom's done with the Saints in the NFL, and we had seen what Taysom had done at BYU prior to Ty Detmer's offense. So I think it's fair for us to look at that and say the 2016 season was not an accurate representation of who Taysom Hill, the quarterback, is. Obviously, those were his stats. Obviously, he has to own those, but there's enough body of work before 16 and after 16 that we kind of know that 16 was just a bad year for Taysom Hill. Now, let's go to Kedon Slovis, where we've also got a lot of data to work with, but let's focus with last year. Focus on last year when Kedon Slovis was at Pitt. Completed 58.5% of his passes. That's right there in the same ballpark as Taysom. 10 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, just a couple touchdowns less and a couple interceptions less, but that same almost 1-to-1 ratio. He finished with a 71.8 PFF grade, so slightly better than Taysom. And all things considered, I was a little bit surprised when I opened up 70 and saw 71.8 as his overall PFF grade. Because in our minds, I think we think that that Keaton fell off a cliff and was just downright terrible at Pitt. But 71.8 is fine. I mean, that's respectable. 4.6% of his throws were turnover-worthy throws, and 3.6% of his throws were big time throws, according to Pro Football Focus. So that's a couple of areas where you can see the similarities. Now, obviously, Kedon Slovis doesn't have that rushing game that Taysom Hill had, so it's not a complete apples-to-apples comparison. But as passers, Kedon Slovis at Pitt was a little bit better than Taysom Hill was in 2016. And BYU was able to do some damage and have a pretty successful season in 2016. So if that's the floor for Kedon Slovis, we're in good shape. But, friends, BYU has been worse. I mean, let's look at Tanner Mangum, right? Tanner Mangum, for his career, all 3 years that he was a starter. So we're not counting 2016. But 2015, when he came in against Nebraska, 2017 and 2018 until he was replaced by Zach Wilson. 59.7%, 57%, and 61%. Those were his completion percentages. Never were very good. 61% was his cap. 23 touchdowns to 8 touchdowns to 5 touchdowns. He got progressively worse as his career went on and his offensive coordinators changed. 10 interceptions as a true freshman, 9 interceptions in 17, 4 interceptions in the few games before he was pulled in 2018. And here's where it starts to get a little bit dicey. In 2018, so his last few games as a starter, Tanner Mangum, 6.3% of his throws were turnover-worthy plays. That's not great. And only 3.5% of his throws were big-time plays. That's not great. So BYU could get that level of play from Kedon Slovis, right? We saw Tanner Mangum as a true freshman, and the numbers were better. The numbers were closer to what we saw from Slovis at Pitt. By the time Tanner Mangum left BYU and lost his starting spot, those numbers were pretty abysmal, and BYU struggled. Having said that, they struggled, but they still beat Arizona. They still beat Wisconsin. They were still able to be competitive, even with pretty lackluster quarterback play, no matter how you look at it. Now, the last couple of years, BYU fans, we have been so spoiled by the quarterback play that we've seen from Zach Wilson and Jaren Hall. But let's take Zach Wilson. We remember his 2020 season. It was an all-timer. It was great. He was also playing against just barely above high school varsity teams. I mean, it wasn't the best schedule, and we would be lying to ourselves if we didn't account for that. So let's look at Zach Wilson the 2 years prior to 2020. Let's look at him when he entered in 2018 and as a starter. And remember, he was hurt in 2019. And I think we're going to find that maybe Slovis doesn't have that far to go. 2018, Zach Wilson completed 65.2% of his passes. 2019, 61.6%. 2018, he threw 12 touchdown passes. 2019, he threw 11. 2018, 3 interceptions. 2019, 9 interceptions. His PFF grade in those years, 80.5 and then 76.2. So PFF always thought pretty highly of him. 2.8% of his plays were turnover-worthy plays as a freshman. 4% of his plays were turnover-worthy plays that following season. But here's where Zach Wilson really separates himself and became the Zach Wilson that we remember. When it came to big-time throws, 6.7%, 5.1%, and then ultimately 8.6% in 2020. Zach Wilson was always trying to push the ball downfield. And that was a product of the Jeff Grimes offense and Aaron Roderick's tutelage. But when you break it down and you start to look at his individual stats, Zach Wilson was great, but he wasn't spectacular. He was great, not spectacular, not elite, but he still had those highlight plays. Jaren Hall, it's a similar story. We look at just the last 2 seasons from Jaren Hall when he was a starter for most of the season. Completed 63.9% of his passes, and then 65.7% of his passes. 20 touchdown passes, then 31 touchdown passes. God, he always took care of the ball. 5 interceptions, and then 6 interceptions. His PFF grades, man, PFF loved Jaren Hall. 89.2 in 21 and 86.3 this last season. Only 2.1% and then 2.7% of Jaren Hall's plays were turnover-worthy plays. And when it comes to big time plays, it was very similar to Zach Wilson, 6.7% and 5.7%. Jaren Hall got to play in this offense, this Aaron Roderick offense. And now I know what we think. When we think of Jaren Hall, he ran the ball a lot too, but not really. I mean, he did, but relative to, say, Taysom Hill, he ran about half as often. 21, Jaren Hall had 307 rushing yards. And this last season, Jaren Hall had 350 rushing yards. So clearly he was a threat with his legs, but he made hay as a passer. He made it to the NFL as a passer, not as a runner. So I think it's a fairer comparison than we think it is to compare Jaren Hall and Zach Wilson and Kedon Slovis. So now it gets back to Slovis. BYU has had elite quarterback play from Zach Wilson and Jaren Hall. It has been elite. No matter what metric you want to look at, it has been elite. So what does Kedon Slovis have to do in order to get to that level? Well, he doesn't have to do a ton. He just has to do a little bit more. Maybe protect the ball a little bit more and push the ball downfield a little bit more. So Kedon Slovis, when it comes to big-time throws, when he was at USC, 4.8%, 4.3%, 5.1%. At Pitt, 3.6%. That's where the drop-off started to come, was when he got to Pitt. We got 3 quarterbacks worth of data from Mangum to Wilson and to Jaren Hall that says that this Jeff Grimes and then Aaron Roderick offense, so basically an Aaron Roderick quarterback coached offense, loves to push the ball down the field. Slovis has done that. He did it at USC. He did not do a ton of it at Pitt. If he starts to push the ball downfield a little bit more, he's proven to be an accurate passer. When he was, let's just go through them all throughout his career. 71.9%, 67%, 64.8%. That was his completion percentages during 3 years at USC. His worst year was 65%. If BYU gets 65% completion percentage out of Kedon Slovis, we're in pretty good shape going into the season. At Pitt, 58.5%. It dipped a little bit, but so did his drop percentage. At Pitt, 7% of his passes were dropped. His adjusted completion percentage is up north of 70. It's 71.1%. That's a respectable number, but it comes down to turnover-worthy plays. Kedon Slovis has got to figure out that decision-making process. Throughout his career, he's thrown about twice as many turnover-worthy plays as either Zach Wilson or Jaren Hall, and he's closer to the Tanner Mangum category when it comes to turnover-worthy plays. So when you look at all of that, he can make the throws, he's accurate, he can push the ball down the field. It's all up here. He's got to make better decisions with the ball in his hand, and that's what Aaron Roderick's offense does. It makes the decision-making process for quarterbacks super easy to do. So there's reasons to be optimistic that Kedon Slovis will have that difficult part of his game, which clearly has been the area he struggled with the most throughout his career. That's kind of going to be taken away from him, for better or worse. That will be taken away from him a little bit, and he will get into the offense. And if he does so, he's got the abilities, the talent, and the track record that he can fall in line with a lot of these BYU quarterbacks of the past. When you look at Taysom Hill's 2016, I think that's kind of the floor. Again, ignore the rushing stats, but 2016 Taysom is a passer, which isn't great. I think that's the floor for Kedon Slovis. And as Taysom proved, if you can do that, BYU can be competitive. They may not hit all of their goals, but they can be competitive. And I think that's the floor for Kedon Slovis. And as you look more recently, Zach Wilson, Jaren Hall, if Slovis gets anywhere near that level of production, then I think BYU is really going to surprise some people. But it starts with the quarterback play, and it starts now. The Big 12 is official. BYU is in. It's been great. Now it's time to get to work. Thank you for supporting the Daily Dose, and until next time, give them hell.